while like for the biblical text, I would say that composition and complexity, we were enriching a dialogue. So we were speaking of numbers as a kind of like a journey, people on the move, and we encounter different things in this movement. And I will say that, well, the dialogue that is happening within the book of Numbers itself, but also between Numbers and the other parts of the Bible as a whole, but more specifically with the Pentateuch, I would say that this kind of like dialogical approach to revelation, dialogical approach to the truth, dialogical approach to wisdom and knowledge, I think that's very enriching, and Numbers is quite a good example of how that is expressed or how that come to be in the biblical text.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guests are Peter Altmann and Caio Perez. This is a first commentary, hopefully first of many. And I'm going to need to figure out a way to approach these to get as much material from the commentary as possible. A lot of the conversation is driven by the introduction, which I think it is helpful. That's how, you should be reading that if you're using a commentary. And that's kind of your approach to the rest of the book and the author, or in this case, the author's understanding and how they guide you through the book. I changed the title from Numbers to In the Wilderness because I think that's cooler, and that is something that we go over in the conversation. Yeah, I don't think I have much more. This will be second to last episode of 2025 as far as original content goes, or as far as a straightforward interview goes. It'll be this, and then Douglas Campbell, which you'll hear a preview of at the end here, and then the 2026 preview. So, that said, if you're listening for free, please follow, subscribe, rate, review, do all of those things, and then head on over to Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Spoutable, Threads, Blue Sky, any of the social media platforms, and give me a follow and drop me a line. And if you have any feedback for me, good, bad, or otherwise, guest suggestions, subjects that I could look into or should look into, if there is a tradition that engages with biblical text that you worry I may not be aware of, hit me up and let me know what that is. And I will do my best to make sure the improvements are made, that your praise is incorporated, or that the guest or subject is worked into the flow of my schedule. You can also become a supporter on Patreon. Link is in the show notes, and you can hear episodes early. So that's all from me. Enjoy my conversation with Peter Altmann and Caio Perez. Take care. Peter Altmann and Caio Perez, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
Hey, Jared, thanks for having us.
Caio, I want to confirm, I did not think to ask, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, my first name was okay, Caio, it's fine, but Perez is better, like the emphasis is on the first syllable.
Okay, so sorry.
No problem.
I do know in Portuguese the two R's is more like a French R, right?
A little bit more guttural than the Spanish R on the tongue.
Like Gracie Baja. Okay. I'll stop being silly for a moment. So before we get going, we'll start with Peter and then go to Caio. Will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, Peter Altmann, I'm the David Allen Hubbard Professor, Associate Professor of Old Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary. I'm just beginning my third year in this position. Before that, I I worked for the University of Zurich for about 10 or 15 years. Perhaps more important stuff about me, I'm married and I have 2 children in their 20s. And I'm kind of split time between Pasadena, California, where Fuller's located, and Reno, Nevada, which is where my family's been for the last generation or so.
Yeah, so my name is like rightly pronounced Caio Pérez. Sorry for that, Jared. But I'm in São Paulo. I'm a native Brazilian, and well, I've been living in Brazil almost my whole life. I only spent two years of my life outside of Brazil when I was doing my master's degree at the university, the Free University of Amsterdam. I'm also married. I have 2 children. I'm I'm a member of a Christian community, uh, and I'm an independent scholar, so I'm not affiliated with any educational institution, and I normally approach things from this kind of like independent position and in relation with my community of faith.
Cool. So this is a first. So we're about 105 episodes into the podcast, and this is the first commentary that I've ever done. So thank you both.
Thank you.
For I'd hope to do more because commentaries are such an important part of biblical studies, and they are kind of a nexus between academic and then the devotional and liturgical, personal end of things. I will say it is regrettable. It's a regrettable bit of branding on behalf of the Book of Numbers, which is what we'll be talking about. Your Tyndale Old Testament commentary. I guess it's an updated volume of the commentary on Numbers because when I requested this one, they sent me the previous version, which maybe I'll reach out to him and get that. I would hope for a rebrand of In the Wilderness, which I did not know is a possible title until I read your introduction. At any rate, we'll go in the same order. How did you guys end up working on this commentary?
I think that's a great question. I mean, first of all, just to hit on where you started, yes, Numbers is not the most attractive title for many, many people who did not enjoy mathematics in at any stage of their education. So, in some ways, why do we have these numbers in the Bible? Thinking about how instead, if we think about it as being this thing about life along the way. That's in part what becomes much more attractive to me. As far as how I came to this book, so my doctoral work was on Deuteronomy, so another book in the Torah on with treating a lot of legal material, and Numbers was in some ways I don't know, hidden, forgotten in my own studies, and I think a lot in biblical or Old Testament studies in general for a lot of years. In some ways, by happenstance, I ended up translating a book of essays by a Catholic German scholar, Christian Frevel, on numbers, and he has been an expert on numbers for decades. And I suppose that's how I got the disease. And from there, I realized, number one, how Numbers has become a much more important book in thinking about especially questions of how do these ancient texts matter for us, and in the ways that it provides some ideas for how to think about how biblical texts can matter to subsequent generations and communities of faith. And so that's really, I suppose, where the intrigue came for me.
Well, my answer can be very short. I was invited by Peter to join him in this work, but also can be a little bit longer. So, well, Peter was working on Deuteronomy for a long time for his PhD, and I was, well, in my master's thesis, I was working on Leviticus. So we were like surrounding Numbers, so to speak, but not actually getting into it. And as with Peter, like numbers was kind of like hidden in well, I was dealing with the priestly theology, priestly tradition, which is, well, most part of numbers, but still, yeah, Leviticus has more like a organized way of putting things, so it was easier to deal with what I wanted to deal with Leviticus. But once I was dealing with numbers, I just came across so many enriching parts of the priestly tradition, and I'm glad Peter invited me to join him in this commentary.
I am curious if we could camp out with you real quick, Kyle.
Sure.
So more of a global, well, I'm assuming, right, coming from the global south as opposed to the north, was there a difference in perspective for the two of you, even though obviously you had a pre-existing relationship that facilitated him inviting you? Not to say was there conflict, but was there a difference of point of view?
Yeah, exactly. It's not like a conflict of different views, but more. I think both of us were very sensible. I always forget, is it sensible or sensitive? uh, but like we're
It could
sensible
be both,
to,
right?
yeah, right. But like sensible to the ethical issues of the biblical text. So, for example, Peter worked for a long time on festival meals, so like dealing with moral and ethical issues concerning sacrifices in Deuteronomy, and I was kind of doing the same thing in Leviticus. So, but I would say that coming from the South and also my life experience, I was a missionary, or I still am a missionary, but now devoting my time on, yeah, doing research and writing. But for a long time, for more than 10 years, I was a missionary working with children and teenagers at risk here in Sao Paulo, and also like the educational approach, kind of like model in Brazil, is much more like a social critical, theoretical on this regard. Not that the North is not like that, but it tends to have more like the North, a more exegetical and historical approach. And for me, it's more I'm more familiar with with dealing with social theories. And so, for example, in the introduction to the commentary, I say like the best that I can say about my approach is that it is a post-colonial approach to the biblical text. So, but like in the working of the commentary, I felt very much in line with what Peter was doing, and I think Peter was feeling the same about me, but he can say for himself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe Jared, just to pick up a little bit for me on what intrigued me to want to invite Caio to write with me. The Tyndale series has, in general, been very uh, traditional in its authorship by North Atlantic white men, and of course, we're both men, so we are still contributing to that aspect. But first of all, the editor David Firth was very supportive and interested in having more global perspectives, and that's something that really fits with my desire as well. Thinking about uh, not that there's something wrong with being a white American uh, educated male. Uh, that's good, but it is my own and my culture's own limitations, and so to be able to invite voices, uh, traditions that God speaks through outside of my own particularity is something that is just really exciting. And Caio's own story, working with young people in the slums of Sao Paulo, certainly provides him with questions and answers that I would never think of. And I think that's a gift that I wanted to highlight. And then Caio was a bit circumspect, but in his work on Leviticus, he's just thought much more about categories of purity and holiness and those types of things that are very important also for the Book of Numbers. And so I thought there was not only a difference in perspectives and experience, but also some differences in our particular expertise that made collaboration Uh, I think something that is desirable both for this commentary and I think in general is something that as a way of writing, we've tended in the for many generations, at least in the West, to have these ideas that it's the individual kind of genius who comes up with some type of breakthrough way of thinking differently or living differently, and I tend to think that it's really more as communities and through collaboration, through risking those type of vulnerabilities, that we can move forward as a church, as communities of faith, and to be open for God's kingdom to be more present in how we live and how we worship.
I think it's interesting to kind of just note the challenge that you invited in saying, "Hey, I want to bring in a perspective that does kind of push back against this." When it's for a book of the Bible in Numbers, that many people express dread when you say, like, "Oh, I'm reading through and I'm coming up on Numbers. Oh, all those begats," which is funny because I feel like Matthew gets off the hook, right? Like that's right off the bat in the Gospels, which nobody's throwing shade at those guys. There's right here at the beginning of the New Testament is a genealogy. I don't think that's a very good. I understand you talked about math. I don't think that's a very good representation of what Numbers does. But this is at the top of the questions that I asked you. Why should people be? And I'll let you guys pick who goes first on this one. So you asked the question in the introduction, why read Numbers? So now, guys, why read Numbers?
Go for it, Kyle.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like all the begettings, I like the way you put it that. But yeah, I think if you go to the kind of like original, maybe original is not the best word, but like the way the book is known in Jewish communities as in the wilderness, or as Peter put it, in the sense of life in the move, that makes it much more sense of what the purpose of the book is. So like one easy or objective answer to this question is just getting to know how this group of people that we call the people of God or Israel, how they are living their lives with God in the way to fulfilling something in the end. And I think that makes a lot of sense for communities of faith and also for individuals, as our life is not stable enough for us to say we arrived at a certain point and that's it. I think we are always in constant movement and also in constant change in our lives because of external situations, but also like our internal journey with God. So I guess Numbers teach us about this process. Not that we are going to replicate the same process, but we still have kind of a model to follow through, to reflect about our own lives as individuals, but also about our lives, especially in communities, and how we navigate this life in the move, on the move, and our life with God in this process.
Maybe I'll add just a second direction that I mentioned earlier, Jared, was thinking about how Numbers in itself is interpreting earlier traditions and earlier texts. So we could think about here about how it gives us signals in how to read Scripture. So it's innovative, it's adaptive, it's applying, and those are the very kinds of questions that communities of faith are working with in their own settings and in our own lives. And so I'd say that the Bible not only is giving us in the book of Numbers, not only is giving us the content of what to believe, but it's also giving us the ways to. It's giving us hints at how to apply it. So how to read Scripture. A couple examples here might be to think about in Numbers 4 and Numbers 8, how it's giving different ages for the Levites for service. in Numbers 9, it's talking about the date of celebration for Passover, and it's working there with texts about Passover that show up other places. There's many more. We can think about Numbers 27 and Numbers 36 and how they're engaging with questions about how do you pass on inheritance. And I think there, when we think about inheritance, we can think both the practical sense, always a very fraught question, but also in thinking about how we pass on values, how we pass on faith. And Numbers is really working through to see how do we follow God, how do we live life with God in our particular time and place. And I think that's also this way that we can get a feel for the texture of how Scripture's dealing with Scripture, and how in some ways it's not something that it's giving us, the 5 rules for how to interpret Scripture, but it's populating our imagination and helping us to be attuned to the divinely inspired ways that we can read Scripture.
So, look, I make silly connections all the time, but one that's popping up in my head is the novel Watership Down, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that? Have you heard of this?
Been a long time.
Okay, so
I'm not at all.
Watership Down is a novel about rabbits. Okay, bear with me. It's a novel about rabbits, and one of them has a dream. They're not anthropomorphic rabbits; they're just rabbits. But one of them has a dream that something bad is going to happen to their warren. And that rabbit and his brother and a handful of others decide to leave. And then something does happen. But then the rest of the novel is them experiencing their trek to go find the new place they're going to live. And they pick up new members to their party along the way. But the substantive thing, and I learned this from Stanley Hauerwas, he has an article about this, that they're telling themselves stories about this like ancient, uber rabbit kind of, and they're understanding who they are and how they should act. And within that is not just an act of creation and cementing themselves in a story. It's also an act of memory, right? And I think for the composition of biblical texts, and I say this a lot because I'm learning it to be true, both the composition, the development, and engagement with biblical text, they're all a negotiation. And you guys can take this, and whoever wants to go first can go first. Like the genre, the composition, all of those things. How important are those to a reader who's just sitting down reading their English or Portuguese or whatever Bible translation? How important are those things to them?
Maybe I'll jump in first here.
Sure.
So maybe a lot of the question, or the first place that your question takes me, is how it raises the question of what are we expecting when we read the Bible, and both in terms of what type of words are we expecting on a page, what are we expecting it to give us, and how are we expecting it to give us that. I think a lot of our challenges in reading Scripture is that our expectations don't always match what's on the page. And so if we're expecting that we're going to read 4 verses and it's going to give us a warm, fuzzy feeling to get us through kind of the next, couple of hours or through the day, I think that's a great thing when it happens. But if that's our approach to devotions, then I think there's much of the Bible that will disappoint us, to say the least, or we'll be reading things in because we're looking for a certain emotional experience. Instead, what we suggest, and I think is pretty common, so this is certainly not something that we've come up with, but we want to use and look at how the various types of texts that are compiled together in the book of Numbers, how they reflect different types of literature and documents and those types of things that we know both in our modern context, but also much more thinking much more about also ancient documents. So one of the examples that we give in the commentary is that you don't pick up a bank statement and expect it to thrill you like a novel. For those of us who like novels, but that doesn't mean a bank statement is bad or wrong, or that we shouldn't read it. We just have to know what we're supposed to be getting from a bank statement, and it's really important for life, for being successful in life. How much, am I financially in the black or am I in the red, and which direction am I moving, and those types of things. So that notion of expectation, I think, is really important. And the challenge when we're reading these texts in our modern languages is because they've all been compiled together in this one big book that we call the Bible. And so we expect that it's all going to somehow be then maybe the same type of literature. And that's true in the sense that it's our community of faith's book that we turn to, that points us to where to find our life with God. Yet the ways that it does that is it brings together all these different types of things. And we list out a number of genres, narratives, prophetic oracles, there's poems, there's, of course, the various senses, and there's itineraries, there's regulations about rituals and practices, there's reports about offerings and deaths and burials, and about battles and festival calendars. And we're pretty good at reading over when it moves from one into the next, because we want this all to be a kind of a story. And there is a story, but if we're just looking for story, then we really miss a lot. And so the invitation, I think, for us as modern readers is to slow down and think about, like, oh, what is it that I am reading now? And how might this type of genre, this communicate, what's it trying to tell me, and what kind of a thing is it trying to tell me? And that can help then shape what the particular content and I suppose goal of that genre can be. I stayed pretty theoretical there. I don't know, Jared, if you want me to land that a bit more, or if that helps.
I want you to be you. I want you to say what's on your mind, both of you.
Caio, do you want to pick up there?
Well, yeah, maybe like one concept that we haven't used here is one that is quite common in like biblical studies at the moment, which is inner biblical interpretation or inner biblical exegesis. And Numbers is quite, I would say, like a prime example of how that appears in the pages of the Bible, as this book that is so diverse in genres. Is that a good pronunciation of the word? Like, well, there are so many different and types of literature inserted in this body of literature, which, as Peter said, there is a story there to be told, and those different genres are being used to kind of like make the story moves on. And but at the same time, I think we the book of Numbers is so complex in its structure that even like the most lay person, while you're reading it, will notice that something is going on with these different types of composition in the book. And well, they might not think of the body of literature as composed, but they would notice that something is different about the structure of the book. And I think that's a good entry for lay readers to perceive how the biblical text is working and what's the purpose of the biblical text. And one last thing that I will say, which is I think for many people, like, complexity is a problem, so they won't try to simplify things, make it more approachable. While, like, for the biblical text, I would say that composition and complexity will be enriching a dialogue. So we were speaking of Numbers as a kind of like a journey, people on the move, and we encounter different things in this movement. And I will say that well, the dialogue that is happening within the book of Numbers itself, but also between Numbers and the other parts of the Bible as a whole, but more specifically with the Pentateuch. I would say that this kind of like dialogical approach to revelation, dialogical approach to the truth, dialogical approach to wisdom and knowledge, I think that's very enriching, and Numbers is quite a good example of how that is expressed or how that come to be in the biblical text.
Yeah, maybe Caio, just to jump in with one little piece there too, to bring out something you've already said, is that this complexity, I think it also it mirrors our human experience, and so what the biblical text is giving us in some ways is a validation of the topsy-turvy way that we experience life. We like to tell if someone asks us who we are and the story of our life, we often put that together with some type of a narrative arc that can be fairly clean. But then when we're telling our stories, we often veer off and take detours left and right, and then there's a dead end that we kind of come back out on, and our lives are more complicated. And Numbers in some ways gives us a reason, a warrant to embrace that, and to embrace that what I think is one of the, if not the core message of Numbers, is that it's about us living life with God, God moving towards God's people, and making a way so that we can be with God as we go on this journey, as we're being constituted, made into, constructed as God's people, that we live into that identity, thinking about Christian theological categories here, that the ways that we could think about sanctification happening, that we are becoming more and more reflective of God at work. And that's really something that Numbers is all about.
I'm glad you mentioned Christian theology there, because one of the things that I have a tough time with, because it seems like it's two different categories. And so there is, particularly with the Hebrew Bible, accepting any particular work or passage on its own terms and reading it within Christian. The way, I think it was Kyle Hughes, the way he said it is, we should read everything through the lens of the resurrected Jesus. Okay, fair enough. However, there is a danger that has been run within Christian theology of reading Hebrew Bible text in a certain way that you end up at the destination of anti-Semitism. And I'm not saying, like, I don't believe that either of you are advocates of that, but are these two separate categories of accepting Hebrew Bible on its own terms and reading within a Christian theological framework?
I think that's a great question. Maybe I'll say a little bit, and then Kyle, feel free to add in where I'm leaving gaps or where you disagree with me. So I think that there are two categories that I have in mind. So one that you've already mentioned. So this idea of let's say a Christological reading, which has a certain narrative that points to the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, which I think is important. However, in and of itself, it requires supplementation. And in some ways here, to just maybe make too large of a statement, but I'll make it anyways, because that can be fun for a podcast. If we think just about like the Apostles' Creed, and how it jumps straight from creation pretty much to Jesus. So there's this whole longer section of scripture that is omitted from that. And I think that's a deep failing of our tradition as Christians. And it does require for us to wrestle with the ways that since the early church that we have understood our own tradition in a way that sets itself up against both against Judaism in all of its non-Christian forms, to say it that way, but also it sets ourselves up against ourselves, because these scriptures are ours as well. And if we're only reading them as something, that's supposed to be pointing to Christ's first advent, well, there's a lot of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament scripture that doesn't fit very well within that arc. So we just don't know what to do with it. So as an antidote, as a solution to that, at least the way that I've found to go forward is to think not only Christologically, but also within a Trinitarian lens. So if Jesus is the image of the triune God, then everywhere that God is appearing in the Old Testament, that includes Jesus. And we don't just need to be looking for some type of veiled, Christophany appearance of Jesus in, wherever it is, as the fourth person in the, in the fire, or in Daniel, or kind of as the angel, or those types of things. Wherever God appears, it is the triune God that appears. And we don't have to put all of this Christological, we don't necessarily have to read all of that in. We can read it as it stands. And what that does is that allows us to think, if we start from the incarnation, so to start again from a Christian theological category, if the incarnation is about God coming to be with humans in that particular first century Jewish body and culture, we can ask ourselves the question, with Numbers or with Old Testament Hebrew Bible texts more broadly, how is it that God is showing up in those particular circumstances and times, which in that way really values the historical, the ancient, pre-Jesus historical settings. And I think it also values our own experiences today in our specific places and times, and the ways that we want to think about and trust that God is with us in, Houston, Pasadena, and Sao Paulo now, that God is with us. That's what the message of Numbers is about, and thinking about how God is with God's people in each particular time and place. So that's at least the way that I wrestle with that.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that
it would be funny if Caio just disagreed with you. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's very interesting because Peter is much more an academic than I am, and at the same time, during the whole process of this book, he has been the one who has provided more. I'll not say maybe not devotional, but more like this Christian approach to life, while I'm pushing things a little bit to more critical stances on how to approach the book, which is exactly the opposite of our, at least our academic formation and life experiences would suggest that things should be. But I would use identity is one of the central themes in Numbers, like trying to define what makes the people of God, what's the identity of the people of God. And the most of this question, which Numbers is trying to give an answer to, we encounter as in the form of encounters. So we encounter in the form of Israel's encounters with different people. And for many simplistic kind of readings of the stories, we would say, yes, well, Israel will come to those regions, places in these encounters with these people, and the identity of Israel as the people of God would just suppress or supersede all the other identities, so that it's kind of like a colonial type of reading of the text. So all the other peoples are just vanished, and what makes Israel is this identity that gets on the top of all those other peoples and identities. And what is interesting about Numbers is exactly how many of those encounters are kind of like a negotiation of the identity of the people of God. It's not a complete denial of other people's identities and possible incorporation and of their identity within the people of God. So I will use one example from a very weird kind of type of text in Numbers, which is itineraries. It's very interesting to see how the itineraries in Numbers 33 works as a kind of like a religious or cultic procession of the movement of Yahweh with the people of God from other cultic and religious places from Egypt, going all the way to the south of the Levant, and then through Canaan. And one possible reading of these itineraries as a kind of like a cultic or religious procession is that Yahweh, as he moves, or they move, depending on the kind of critical approach you have for the divinity. But as Yahweh is moving, he's just like suppressing all other identities and all other deities and all other peoples. At the same time, we can read it as a form of Yahweh incorporating those peoples, those identities, and even those cultic places as part of who he wants his people to be or who he wants Israel to be. So that's kind of like a openness for other identities to participate in the identity of the people of God. And so what I say from what Peter has said is that as we accept that our identity and our experience with God is limited to our own history, stories, experiences, and that does not negate or throw away others people's experiences and identities and their relationship with God. So if we think about Christians and Jews reading the same text, coming from very different perspectives and concluding very different things, if we accept that our conclusions are not exhaustive and is able to incorporate other people's experiences and other people's identities in their relationship with God, I think we are in a much better founding for like interfaith conversations.
So I do wonder if, Caio, from your point of view, I'm just going to here. I'll describe what I feel my exposure to the understanding of reliance on the divine was growing up in America. That it is almost that trust in the divine is almost as their presence as the guarantor of security, supremacy, dominance, that kind of thing. I, as an American, have that attitude. Is that something you see us? Sorry, Peter. Is that something you see us bringing to the text, whether we know it or not?
I would say yes, and I would say not because you're American, but because I think that's a problem in the evangelical tradition as a whole and Christianity in the history of humankind as a whole. So I don't think this is particularly true of Americans, Christian Americans or evangelical Americans, but that's true of evangelicals as a whole. So, for example, in Brazil, in the evangelical tradition, the most horrifying cases of religious intolerance are caused by evangelicals against African, Brazilian religions. So, like even breaking idols, even destroying their cultic places, and that's well, that that tells a lot about our theology, our way of living as a community of faith, and what we believe about our God. And that's, of course, very problematic. So it's not, you cannot claim this problem for yourselves only. I think that's a problem that we face as evangelicals all over the world.
We do try to do that though, right? Claim things as our own. Peter, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I'm happy to let Caio's words stand.
We're hovering around 40 minutes, and because there are two of you, I want to make sure I don't miss out on these. we have not covered that much ground at all because there's so much in there. But what were you hoping when you were signing on today? You were like, I hope he asks about this. Uh, is there anything in particular you were hoping would come up from the commentary?
Let's see. If I look through the kind of the questions that you put out there, I wonder if maybe we could go through just some of those sections we had in the introduction that you asked about, to think about the things we find to be particular about our own approach. Does that sound like a good way to go?
Absolutely.
Maybe I'll start off with the one that I know best, Caio, which is this question of what is biblical law. I think that at least in my teaching experiences in the church, I find that the ways that we tend to approach law in the Bible is unsurprisingly much through our own modern understandings of how law functions, or at least how we think it functions in the West. So this idea of the rule of law, something we hear appealed to, this idea that society is supposed to be based on not on some type of a constitution that then that legislators make, that there's some type of executive that carries that out, and that there's courts then that adjudicate whether it's being followed or not. Of course, I'm there just parroting my own understanding from high school government as a senior in high school. And I think that's pretty normal for U.S. Americans. And instead, what we encounter in the ancient world, I would say at least in pre-Roman law, is these understandings of law that are not used nearly in the same way. So instead, what we have, for example, with Hammurabi's laws, which are earlier than our biblical laws, and in fact, our biblical laws borrow some things from Hammurabi's laws. We have something that's much more a statement about the ideal, the way things are supposed to be, translated into perhaps our Christian language. So an image, or at least that person's image, if we're thinking about Hammurabi here, or if we think about Numbers and Exodus through Deuteronomy, we're thinking about visions of the kingdom of God, and that these are not, in that sense, supposed to be what a court would use, or what a ruler would draw on to say, this is how we're gonna live this out. That it's a much more complex process, that instead what these laws are supposed to do is form the way we think about the world, that they're not the concrete things that we draw on. And maybe just to take an example that supports this, is that there's very few citations of biblical law texts, so the prescriptions and those types of things, throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible. It's just not used that way. And also even into Persian and Hellenistic periods. So thinking about the times before and after Alexander the Great conquers what we now call the Middle East, that's just not the way that communities of faith are using these texts. And so instead, and what that opens up, I think, for us, it's really helpful, is that it means that we don't necessarily have to expect there to be this static and unchanging kind of law code, a word that I've avoided so far in the conversation, for what we see when we read these texts. We don't need to kind of put it all together somehow to form the constitution that we then somehow live our lives based on. But we can see instead how God in the tradition is showing people of faith how they can dream and imagine, and of course that's going to affect the way they live and decisions that are made. But it's much more about forming us as people. And so thinking about biblical literature and Numbers here as part of that, as formational, rather than as perhaps only getting caught in maybe a Pauline, so thinking here about Romans or Galatians or Hebrews, that the law was the old, and we somehow replace that with love or with grace or with faith or something like that. Instead, biblical law, I would say, is an example of life of faith in a particular time and place, and in more than one in times and places. And one of the ways that we see this just within the narrative of the Pentateuch itself, so to step just outside of Numbers, but to see the way that we have the Ten Commandments show up in Deuteronomy when they were already given in Exodus, that they're given for another time and place, and there's another way of thinking about how these laws function a little bit differently. And that's the same type of thing that we see going on in Numbers. And I think if we approach reading the book of Numbers with that perspective, which I call, or we call, reading in concert, rather than just reading sequentially in the introduction, that can be such an invitation towards a deep kind of reading of these legal texts that forms us as individuals and people of faith. So that's one that I'm obviously have some passion around. I know Caio there were other ones that were really exciting for him.
For the listeners here, let me just jump in. So I wanted to bring these up. I'm glad you brought these up, but I was worried it would eat up too much time. So it's 5 key concepts that they identify. So the first one is, what is biblical law? The second is Israel's identity and its neighbors. The third is from purity to holiness, then atonement and ritual, and then the different types of offerings. So, Caio, are there any of those 5 that you feel? I mean, and you could talk about all the 4 rest of them if you want to. You're the guest. You guys do whatever you want.
I want, but I'll take to the impurity to holiness issues here. But before I get to that, I think a good segue that would lead me to that is talking about law and what Peter said about the law being formative. I will use, I don't know if you agree with that, Peter. I think so. Like the formation of wisdom. So it's more about like giving models for us to form our ways of thinking. So wisdom to tackle different situations that are not presupposed or not included in the text itself, right?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for bringing that in.
And for that, I would say one of the criterion for that formation of wisdom, I'll take to Numbers 9 again, which is kind of like a negotiation between Moses, the people, and Yahweh about what happens if people within the camp are in a state of impurity during the Passover. So they bring up that situation that is not elaborated in previous instructions about Passover. And they come up in a dialogue. So Moses, the people, and Yahweh, what they should do. And the conclusion that they take is that, well, let's do the next month. So the second month, those who were in a state of impurity will celebrate Passover. For me, that's very interesting because that gives us one criterion for how do we change biblical law? How do we adapt and innovate biblical law? So first of all, you already have something to work with. So it's not that when you're innovating or adapting that you're throwing away what came before. You're actually working out with that previous instruction. But also, the criterion is to deal with groups of people who are vulnerable to the instructions, to the previous instructions. So, like in Numbers is I think from Exodus to Deuteronomy, if you do not celebrate Passover, you must be deemed as outside of the people of God. So, for this group of people who are in a state of impurity, for them not to celebrate makes them vulnerable to be excluded from the people of God. So the criterion that I'm working with here for innovation of biblical law is dealing with groups of people who are in a vulnerable situation because of the previous instruction. That is the same movement and dynamic that happens in Numbers 27 and Numbers 36 as well, as they negotiate how they should change previous instructions about inheritance and who are able or not able to inherit the piece of land, which is of course one main thing in from Exodus to, or even from Genesis, the whole Pentateuch, the inheritance of land as a land that is promised by God as a blessing to the descendants of Abraham. So yeah, I think that that's something very important for Christians today, as they try to avoid negotiating with the text because they do not consider how many biblical texts can put different groups of people in a vulnerable situation that will exclude them or that will cause violence against them. So before the rigidness of the law, there is the grace and the love of God for the people inside, outside of who we consider the people of God or not.
I think, if I may, in that list, I'm particularly interested in the idea of atonement and ritual, because I think, going back to something Peter was saying earlier about narrative, I think a failing in Christian theology is that, like the Hebrew Bible serves as just like a cold open for Jesus, but not even Jesus in general, not even the New Testament, the crucifixion. And this is an issue, and it's come up on the podcast before. This is a beef that I have with evangelical theology, the crucicentric idea that I think robs the incarnation overall. And I think when you actually engage with Hebrew Bible texts and attempt to engage them on their own terms, you find a terrestrial nature to those texts and to what their concerns were that does not really allow for a notion that, oh, this whole enterprise is an abortive attempt to do what this thing does properly. That oh, here's a failed way, and atonement is a really good example of that. The way that Christian minds understand what atonement is, and shout out to people like Andrew Rillera and David Moffat, who are New Testament scholars, who are trying to, I guess, refocus an understanding on what does Hebrew Bible represent atonement as, and how does that appear in New Testament. I will try to stop rambling as quickly as possible, but does that, like, how would you communicate to Christians atonement and ritual as represented in the book of Numbers?
Caio, let me jump in and maybe make a little framework to set you
Sure.
up. So maybe one place to jump in here would actually be think just about the different types of offerings. Notice we didn't use the word sacrifices because there's a lot of connections with that term or associations that I think are unhelpful or limiting in just the ways you're talking about, Jared. So one of the reasons why we chose to devote a section to talking about the different types of offerings is that so often in Christian theology, we focused simply on this notion of everything being about atonement and a certain type, a certain particular understanding of atonement. And we wanted to just note that there's much broader set of concerns. In other words, God cares about many more things, or to maybe talk about it this way, ritual and atonement are much more complex, thankfully, than ways that they've often been talked about in Christian theology. So, like, if we just go through, and there could be more that we would talk about, but one that I love pointing out is this idea of what's often translated as a peace offering or a fellowship offering. There are various translations in English. In Hebrew, it's the Zebach Shelamim, which we've chosen to translate as shared offering feast, the key word there being feast. This has nothing to do with dealing with sin or moral failing or something like that. It's really about getting together as a group and having a party at the sanctuary. That is a part of what ritual atonement and offering that this whole kind of set of concerns is about. It's not just about dealing with the stuff that we've messed up as individuals or as groups, but it's about celebration. It's about enjoyment and bodily enjoyment. And the things that you bring for those include alcoholic beverages. It focuses also on meat, which was so rare. It wasn't something that a normal person ate very often in ancient society. And so I think what that does is it can shift the ways that we think about ritual and atonement. And I say all of that just as a prelude to let Caio talk, I think, more directly about your question.
Yeah, sure. Um, yeah, one interesting thing, Peter, is that when you said the focus would be on the word feast, in my mind, I always thought, oh, you're gonna highlight the word shared, because for me, it's also about the sharedness, so to speak, about the experience. Like especially if you think about numbers as kind of this collective and community kind of literature. Uh, but yeah, well, shared and feast go very well together. But yeah, well, Peter was very conscious and intentional when he said about atonement and like some specific definitions of atonement. And I like to bring that up because I don't take the meaning of the word atonement in the way that is used in Christian theology as a given. So normally the way that the word is used or the concept as it is used is very well related to expiation. And I think there was a reason for Tyndale to come up with a new word for this for the Hebrew word kippur, uh, creating this new word atonement, which basically, and of course words are kind of like have their own lives and they gain meaning in the process of history. But to think about the original intention of Tyndale in the coinage of the word atonement, it is pretty much about encountering or pretty much about uh, yeah, getting close to or being in the presence of coming together, like togetherness. Maybe that's a good word to use. And for example, you brought up Andrew Hilera here, and of course I appreciate a lot of what he has done. But one thing that I don't agree with him is actually to accept the traditional Christian meaning of the word atonement in this sense of expiation and retribution and substitution, uh, because I think that the whole process, the whole cultic process in from Leviticus to Deuteronomy is actually a process, especially in Leviticus, is a process of approaching or getting close to Yahweh. So actually, uh, atonement, I think, is kind of like a kind of like an umbrella concept in priestly theology, that underneath it comes many different concepts as purification, as consecration, as expiation. So for me, and I have argued that not only in the commentary on Numbers, but also in a previous article that I've wrote specifically on Leviticus 5 verses 11 to 13, which deals with the possibility of atonement without blood. So by means of flour, or what's yeah, fine flour is a good term for it. So I take atonement more as kind of like this umbrella term that will explain the whole process of getting close to or getting together with Yahweh in his indwelling, so the tabernacle, but we can say like his home. Uh, and I think that's quite an important thing, because as Peter was saying, like that there are different types of offerings, even with if we say that some are dealing with something specific for the people to get close to Yahweh, is still is part of the process of getting close to it. And I would say actually take all of those different offerings as functioning for the same purpose, which is to have the presence of Yahweh available for the people to enjoy, and they will enjoy the presence of Yahweh through bodily means or incarnational means, which is the shared offering feast, to use the term that we chose for the Zebach Shelamim. And for something about rituals is that, of course, as evangelicals, specifically evangelicals, I would say we are very depreciative of rituals, not only because of how Jews use rituals in their experience with God, but also about how Catholics use rituals in their experience with God. And I would say that, I mean, it's inevitable for us to actually use rituals. If you kneel down in your room, like in your bedroom, and you're praying to God, you are doing ritual as well. You're not doing this kind of like a spiritual thing that is not at all related to your body. You're doing the same thing as other people who had for a long time set some specific rituals that will facilitate their experience with God. And so I take rituals as a kind of like a human technique for us to make the divine presence more materially perceived. That's the arrangement of words that I come up with. And I think not only that makes sense for our experience as humans in the sense of our religious experience, but also how we work as animals, as bodies, and that's something that neuroscience has already also investigated, how we make kind of like ethereal or not so much material things real for us is through many different techniques, of which rituals is one of them.
Yeah, I don't see anything to. I do want to get a hold of that article that you mentioned though. But we could talk about that later. We have busted an hour, so out of gratitude for the two of you being here, I do want to cover these really quickly. So my last two questions, and I'll kind of throw them to you both at the same time. Normally, I'll say, what would you recommend that people read, watch, listen to learn more about this subject? I will say, by the commentary, there's a long bibliography at the front. So that would be my suggestion. Anything in addition to that, and we'll go Caio, then Peter, that you would recommend. But also, what do you read for fun?
Well, my recommendation was well, there is a very good website called thetorah.com with many Jewish scholars, but also some non-Jewish scholars as well contributing for that website. And they have many articles on issues that are very much related to numbers, such as itineraries or the tabernacle or the Ark of the Covenant and stuff like that. So I would highly recommend people to go there and check out by some kind of key terms, or even I think that their search engine also works with kind of like a biblical reference, and they will guide you to different kind of articles. So I would recommend that. Should I already
Some that I
say
would say maybe
what I
just
read for fun? So, oh, sorry, Peter.
Oh, I wasn't going to let you off the hook. I would have let him finish, and then I would have made sure you. But yeah, go ahead.
Um, well, that's a difficult one though. But I'm very much into punk rock and emo music, so I very much enjoy reading stuff about kind of like tooth and nail history and the nostalgia of those like late '90s Christian punk rock and emo music. So I enjoyed that.
that's awesome. I did not know that about you. Maybe a couple things that I would pick out of our bibliography, or there might even be one or two that didn't make it in there because they were being published at the same time as our commentary. I think there are a range of new works on numbers. There's kind of a renaissance, we could say, in numbers scholarship, which, you know, that means there's probably 4 things that are published. It's not exactly like, Romans or something. But there was an updated version of Timothy Ashley's commentary in the Nikot series. I think also thinking more globally. There's and I don't know how to pronounce his name. Michel Modine has published a commentary in the Langham series, so bringing more of a global perspective. Thinking more theologically and maybe less tied directly to the text. There's also David Stubbs's work in the Brazos series. So those are some works that I think can be helpful. As far as just a classic for non-scholars, I will tip my hat to my PhD advisor, to Dennis Olson, who has just a really well-written commentary in the Interpretation series. I think too, there's just some stuff you can get online, like Calvin's works on these other 4 books of the Pentateuch. So Exodus through Deuteronomy, very thorough, just to get out of our own time. And similarly, also then to look up the medieval Jewish commentator Rashi and see how he's asking some very similar and some very different questions to the ones that we're asking. Again, not because I think that the questions of our time and place are bad, but they're limited. And so to allow us to think other thoughts, to ask other questions, I think those are really helpful. In terms of what I'm reading and stuff like that, outside of the scholarly world, right now I'm reading Marilyn Robinson's novel Home. I'm really just fascinated with this idea of thinking about the places where we are and the places where we're from. So Wendell Berry's poetry is all something I pick up most days along that line, and also getting outside of my own tradition, or reading Pablo Neruda, and who I think is just one of the most exquisite poets of all time. So, but I can read about a half of a poem at a time. So it's hard work. It's hard work for my heart, but it's good stuff.
All reading is hard for me because I'm not particularly good at it. So I definitely identify with you. I love it, but I'm not good at it. Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. And thank you for sitting down longer than you had agreed to. So unless you have anything else, I'm going to call this one good.
Thanks, Jared.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Take care. Okay. Thanks so much for being here. Whether you're watching or listening, I appreciate your support. Next week, Douglas Campbell will be here to discuss rereading Romans 1 through 3. So back in 2023, I had Chris Tilling and Curtis Freeman on to discuss their chapters from the book Beyond Old and New Perspectives on Paul. And that was a book that Chris had edited, and it is about the work of Douglas Campbell. So next week on the podcast, Douglas Campbell, we will be discussing his chapter, or one of his chapters in that book, rereading Romans 1 through 3. And so, cards on the table, when Daniel Rodriguez, also a past guest, when Daniel and I were first having the conversations that made me really start to want to do the podcast again in 2020 and 2021, there were a handful of people that kept coming up in the conversation whose work seemed really interesting to me. Among them were the late Jacob Milgram, the still living Ryan Stokes, and Douglas Campbell. The work that Daniel and I were discussing was so interesting from those people that when I said, hey, I would like to do the podcast that we talked about back in 2011, and Daniel said, yeah, I don't think that's for me, I just said, I'm going to start cold calling people. Because if there were, and there were more, but if there were people like them that I kept being fascinated by hearing what their work was, and then I started to read their work and realized that, like, wow, this is pretty cool. There has to be a lot more out there. So that, Douglas Campbell plays a large part in the genesis of this podcast. He's someone I wanted to have on since very early, but I throw a lot of invitations out there, and I end up focusing my attention where I get yeses. And so I was fortunate enough that several of his students and colleagues, I suppose, put a bug in his ear, and Andrew Rolera reached out to me and said, "Hey, you should send an invitation." So I did, and I got a yes, and I'm very excited, and I hope to have Douglas on more than just this once. I don't mean to be presumptuous, but I hope that is something we can make a reality, because there's a lot more work of his that I want to be able to discuss. But I felt like, and I kind of went back and forth, and I asked, Chris what he thought, and Daniel what he thought, and Andrew had made a suggestion. I think I even reached out to John Depew, like, hey, what should I? And I just kind of did my best to combine those recommendations and average them out. And the place I came to is, you know what? I know I have the book. I know I can read it quickly. I'm going to do that. And I'm going to fire off questions to him on this chapter. So I know that this is getting to be kind of wordy. Here is a preview of my conversation with Douglas Campbell. It will be the final full interview of 2025. And then the week after that will be the 2026 preview. So there will not be a tag next week. Yeah. If you're listening for free, you can get access to this episode in audio or video, this interview with Douglas Campbell, for $5 a month right now on Patreon. Use the link in the show notes. It's $5 a month, and you get stuff 10 days early until 2026, and it'll be about 12 days early, I think. I decided to start dropping free episodes the Friday of the week after the Monday that they were released on Patreon. It's just a better flow for me to have a new episode coming out on Monday and a new episode coming out on Friday, because I like to push out promotional videos and clips when I do new interviews. And so now when I do a new interview, it can kind of just be on its own most of the time when I push that out. So, okay. Yeah, I don't have anything else. Thank you so much for your support, and I hope you enjoy this preview of my conversation with Douglas Campbell. If you get a chance to love someone, you should take it.
Unfortunately, when Paul's letters were edited into the version that we have them in now in our Bibles, sort of end of the 2nd century, they were organized in terms of length, and Romans is just the longest. It just beats out 1 Corinthians. And I often ask myself, gosh, if only Paul had decided to write more about the collection in 1 Corinthians, and it had been the first letter in length, we would have started off all our thinking about Paul with 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, and the theology of the cross, and election, and the God of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit gathering us in. And things might have been very, very different, but it's just a quirk of fate that we ended up with Romans. We ended up with this opening argument. We ended up with a very sophisticated argument by Paul that relies on performance. And in a Bible, in a canon, you've lost all the performance. You've lost all the local cues. So it's so easy to misunderstand this. It's so understandable that people got the wrong end of the stick. It really makes sense. Once you've got the parting of the ways, and Christians are not worried about dumping on Jews, it becomes even easier to read it the usual way. Once you've got Constantinianism, you're signing off on the death penalty. You don't have a problem with it. The death penalty is no longer being inflicted on you for being a Christian. You're inflicting the death penalty on people who step out of line. So you get a complete flip in how you understand Romans 1. And it's so understandable. It requires a lot of effort to get back there and go, hey, something's off here.